Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. There has been some confusion generated surrounding the protocols expected of the broker holding an open house. And some of the confusion has been generated because as NAR is releasing information to help brokers across the country understand implementation of the NAR settlement agreement, some of the information that applies broadly to brokers across the country does not apply, or it applies differently to brokers in Washington state. And one of those areas involves protocols expected of a broker holding an open house. Now, let's just start with the notion that you're the listing broker holding your own listing open. A buyer comes in, you absolutely have no obligation to enter a buyer agency agreement with that buyer. If that buyer wants to see the house, wants to write an offer on the house, your obligation to that buyer is to disclose that you represent the seller exclusively. They are unrepresented. You deliver an agency law pamphlet to them. You engage in all of the protocols that are required of any listing broker assisting an unrepresented buyer to purchase seller's property. But we've covered that in a different video. In this video, I want to talk about the broker who is not the listing broker, but who is holding the listing broker's listing open. So now you're the broker sitting at an open house. It's not your listing, meaning you do not represent the seller. And that is a true statement. If you're not the listing broker, if you have not been named as an agent of the seller in the listing agreement or an amendment to the listing agreement, then you are not the seller's agent, even if you're on the same team as the listing broker, even if you're in the same firm as the listing broker. You're not the listing broker, you're not the seller's agent, which means you are a buyer's agent. So any potential buyer who comes along and wants to see that property, you are a buyer's agent. So what does that mean with respect to entering a buyer brokerage services agreement? Remember the timeline associated with entering a buyer brokerage services agreement. You are required to enter that agreement with any buyer that you represent before or as soon as reasonably practical after you commence providing real estate brokerage services to that buyer. When that buyer comes into the open house that you're holding, you represent that buyer. There is no conceivable way that you should stop a buyer at the threshold of the door, at the threshold of the property, and say, you cannot enter this property unless you first sign a buyer agency agreement with me. That would be ridiculous and anything but consumer friendly. And so our law says that you're required to enter the brokerage services before or as soon as reasonably practical thereafter. And so as soon as reasonably practical in this case is not before you show them the property, even though when you show them the property, you are serving as their agent. But after they view the property, let's see what happens next. If they wave goodbye and say, thanks, I always wanted to see this house, I just live right around the corner, you're never going to see that buyer again. They're a looky-loo, and they just wanted to see the inside of seller's house. Well, they did. And although you were a buyer's agent when they view the property, you don't need an agency agreement with that buyer because they're not actually a buyer and they're not coming back. But if that buyer says either, I'd like to write an offer on this property, or can you show me other properties? Then in either of those cases, you are going to have a future relationship with this buyer. And now is the time that you must enter a brokerage services agreement with this buyer. If this buyer wants you to write an offer for this property right now, then the very next thing you do is deliver an agency law pamphlet and you negotiate, you explain your brokerage services agreement with that buyer. And only after that buyer signs your brokerage services agreement do you ask the question, so what terms would you like to offer the seller for the purchase of this property? Or if the buyer says, I'd like to go look at other properties with you, then before you show another property to this buyer, you consult with the buyer about the terms of the buyer brokerage services agreement. and your mutual expectations of one another in this relationship. And then you enter a brokerage services agreement with the buyer, and only after that happens do you then show them other houses. If you have questions about open house protocols or anything else, please send a question to me by visiting warealtor.org and following the links to the Legal Hotline. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.